you swallow a penny by accident, which organs will the penny go through? And so I'm really asking you here is, do you know the difference between the tract and the accessory organs? So the organs that the penny would go through would be number 1, your mouth, number 2, your esophagus, number 4, notice I'm skipping number 3. Number 3 is your liver. Food does not go in there. I'm also skipping number 5, which is my pancreas. And if I was going in order, number 7 comes next, because that's the small intestine. Then number 6, then number 8. Now, I didn't say that you had to put them in order necessarily here. So if you had the correct 6 numbers, I would mark this question correct. But keep in mind, putting things in order could be a question that I would ask you. So let's give 3 points here, like 0.5 for each of the numbers. Same thing. If you wrote out the names, like if you said mouth, esophagus, stomach, small, large intestine, you're saying the same thing as picking it over there. Keep in mind that you would have to be able to recognize what it looked like visually. And I'm sure that you knew that answer anyways, and that's why you were writing them down. But I could, for example, ask you, like, what's number 7? And I would expect that you know that it's the small intestine. Does anyone else have questions they want to ask about 1? So then 2. If my mouth were injured so that food could not enter through it, basically I'm saying my mouth is no longer part of my digestive tract. Food is not going in it. So what processes are going to be affected? First of all, ingestion is absolutely going to be affected, because that is the process of putting food in. If I can't do that, well, then I can't do ingestion. But I will also be affecting digestion, both chemical and physical. So remember, you have teeth in your mouth, but you also have saliva and enzymes in your mouth. So ingestion and digestion would both be affected. Now, I would make this question probably out of 2, so that as long as you had 2 of the things that are affected, you got the marks. Number 3 asks you if I had my canine teeth removed. So those are your, if you were a vampire, the teeth that would be long and sharp. Which process would be affected? Now, we could take this in a couple of directions. We could talk about the general process that your teeth do. And the general process that your teeth do is physical digestion. We could also be pretty specific about specifically what your canine teeth do. If you look at the chart about teeth, your canine teeth have the role of cutting and holding your food. Your incisors also cut your food, so you would still be able to take bites of food, but canine teeth are really for holding food in place, not just in humans, but especially in other organisms that are hunting. And so if we wanted to be specific, it would be the idea of holding food in place. That's the specific function that canine teeth do that other teeth don't. But physical digestion is the general process that all of your teeth perform. So I would make this one just out of 1. You could describe it either way, and I would have accepted it. Question number 4 asks, why can I swallow when my head is upside down? The quick answer is that peristalsis is happening. I would expect that you could do more than say the word, though. I would expect that you knew that this meant muscle contractions, and that those muscle contractions happen above the food or behind the food, let's say, and they push the food from your mouth through your esophagus to your stomach. So for this daily review, we'll just say it's out of 1. Either you said the word peristalsis or you described what it meant. Either way, you can have the mark. This is then out of 7. If you could make a total out of 7, please. So just so everybody is clear, we ended on this slide last time talking about the teeth that you have in your mouth. And so here we're starting with a couple more things that happen in your mouth. We already alluded to the fact that chemical digestion happens in your mouth, but just so that it's specifically stated, your mouth contains salivary glands, which are an accessory organ. They're below your tongue and above the roof of your mouth. The saliva that comes out of these accessory glands contains water, but it also contains an enzyme. And so we discussed what enzymes do earlier on in the course. But the job of an enzyme is generally, in digestion, to help take a large molecule and make it smaller. The specific enzyme is called salivary amylase. You would need to know that name. And the specific thing that it is digesting is a starch, and it's making a disaccharide out of it. And so I showed you a little video clip that illustrated that. I'm going to play another little video clip that's specifically about amylase in just a minute. When we're talking about salivary amylase, there is an alpha version, there is a beta version, and it goes on and on. Those are all Greek letters. And the letter in front of the name of the amylase is trying to indicate which piece of the molecule it's going to cut. Amylase acts on starch. Remember, starch is a large polysaccharide. And it breaks down starch eventually into disaccharides. Specifically, we hear or we see that maltose is usually what we get. The reason that we're getting maltose is because that is 2 units of glucose. And so if I'm just cutting up a starch made of a bunch of glucose, cutting off 2 little chunks gives me maltose. So even though we're not specifically talking about enzymes here or carbohydrates, that information still comes into play. The other thing that I wanted to mention about the enzyme is that it speeds up hydrolysis. It does not make hydrolysis happen. It does not itself break the starch in 2. It is the thing that makes the reaction that was already going to happen faster. So remember, the way that it does this is that it reduces activation energy. So the amount of energy it requires to get a reaction going is reduced when I have my enzyme as part of the pathway. Does anyone want to ask any questions about enzymes or their function or this particular enzyme, perhaps? The other thing maybe that I'll just remind you of is polysaccharides or any sort of carb usually has a hexagon looking shape as the base structure. And so if you were ever to see a picture of them, keep in mind that that's usually what a sugar or a carbohydrate molecule looks like. Now the other thing is absorption, and even though very, very little happens in the mouth, we still need to mention it because there is a particular example or two where it happens. The reason very little absorption happens in the mouth is because the length of time and because of the amount of digestion that has already taken place. And the answer to both of those is very little. Usually, food is in your mouth for a very short time. So think about while you're eating, you take a bite, you chew it, and then generally you swallow it. That's it. It's there for a few seconds, maybe up to a minute if you're really chewing and it's difficult to chew and you're savoring it or something. But usually, seconds is how we would measure how long food is in your mouth. The second thing is the amount of chemical or physical digestion. And the reason that this is important is because the molecules are too large still at this point. There's no way they would get through the lining of your mouth and be absorbed into your bloodstream, for the most part because they're too big. Either your teeth haven't broken them down enough physically, or even if it's a really small particle, an enzyme hasn't been there to help break it down chemically. Now I put a few exceptions here, but even for these exceptions, it's not like a ton of it gets absorbed in your mouth, just that some of it can be. So molecules that do not require digestion, like alcohol, water, and I put some drugs here. There's too many for us to really name all of them, but there are some types of both prescription and non-prescription, i.e. recreational drugs, that could fall into that category. I don't want to talk about recreational ones too much and give you any sort of instructions on how to use them, but if we're talking alcohol or water, think about both of them. They're both liquids. Things that are in liquid format usually have an easier time moving about. Now I know that you all drink water and that none of you are old enough to drink alcohol, but when you are old enough and you taste beer for the first time, first thing you'll notice, if you leave beer in your mouth, beer has carbohydrates in it, and if you leave it in your mouth long enough, your saliva will start digesting and it'll start tasting sweet. Same effect you get if you put a soda cracker in your mouth and leave it there for a little while. But second, the alcohol in the beer that you have never tasted will get absorbed slowly, but a little bit, right into your bloodstream from your mouth if you were to hold it in your mouth. If you just take a swig and swallow it, that's not long enough for even alcohol to go through the lining of your mouth. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask here? So let's talk about your stomach. Let's maybe make it so we can see the whole page. Okay, I was on an entire page. There we go. So when we're talking about your stomach, here are a few of the things that are important. Your stomach is made out of muscles. And so the first thing I want you to be aware of is that muscles do stuff. They contract. You know this because we just talked about muscles. What type of muscle is in your stomach? Generally smooth muscle. That means muscle that you don't have to physically control. Now, just on this point, I would like to distinguish between your stomach muscles and your abdominal muscles, which are two different things. Your abdominal muscles are the ones that are attached to your skeleton that help you move. And so, for example, when I bend my knee up like that, there's a muscle in my abdomen that's helping me do that. Those are abs. Your stomach muscles are way farther on the inside. So you would have to go through a whole bunch of layers of tissue before you got to your stomach muscles. Does anyone have any questions about that? So when you're doing sit-ups, you are not exercising your stomach muscles, you are exercising your abdominal muscles, which are attached to your skeleton. So your stomach is a muscular organ that is involved in physical and chemical digestion of food, and a bit of absorption. Now, if we had to pick one thing that stands out as the primary function, we would say that the primary function of your stomach is the physical and chemical breakdown specifically of proteins. So it can help digest chemically and physically other types of macromolecules, but the thing that the stomach is known for is the way that it digests protein. So we'll talk about the substances that the stomach produces to help with this digestion. But first, we'll talk about just sort of the anatomy of your stomach. There are actually a lot of terms for the pieces of your stomach, and most of them I'm not going to expect you to be aware of. You should be aware of the shape of your stomach. It kind of looks like the letter J if you were to look at the shape of your stomach. Sort of a really fat, thick, bubbly letter J, but a letter J nonetheless. And the parts of the stomach that we're going to focus on are actually the entrance and the exit. So you have valves that control the entry and exit of food into your stomach. Valves, which are called sphincters, so that's where that word comes from anatomically, are circular, oh my goodness, muscles. So without muscles, there is no way that we could control food coming into and food leaving our stomach. These circular muscles have a hole in the middle. If I contract the valve, I close the hole. If I relax the valve, I open it, and relaxation is when food can pass through. So here is an example of your muscles helping you maintain homeostasis. Without muscles, you could not regulate the entry and exit of food from your stomach. Now there are two valves, one on the bottom of the esophagus, right about here. That valve is called the cardiac valve. And more commonly, especially recently, we're calling it the esophageal sphincter or esophageal valve. The reason it was called the cardiac valve is because your heart is right there. But since it's not actually attached to your heart, it's attached to your esophagus. I thought I would mention that this tends to be the more commonly used name these days, but depending on what we're reading and what source we're looking at, it might still be called the cardiac valve. Now the one at the end, you can see in the picture right here, is shown as being closed. So it kind of looks like the two sides are pinched together. That's what a closed valve looks like. It is called the pyloric valve. And I will tell you a story. When my brother was a baby, he had this thing called pyloric stenosis. His pyloric valve did not work properly. And for, I forget exactly how long my mom said it was, but a long time, he would either throw up or diarrhea out anything that was fed to him, which I can only imagine would have been fantastic. My daughter has had diarrhea a few times, but only like for a few hours at a time. And this was like weeks and weeks and weeks of him just diarrhea pooping or throwing up all over everything. So if either one of those valves does not function, you're going to have trouble keeping food down. Now your stomach is, it says, a stretchable bag. And I'm going to talk about this point a little bit. Your stomach stretches. It expands as food enters. If I did something to make it so that my stomach could not stretch, well then not as much food would be able to enter. And so this idea of the stomach stretching and that being the thing that allows more food to enter is the kind of idea behind Stomach stapling, or any of these slim band things that you may have seen on TV, where it's supposed to constrict the size of your stomach and help you lose weight. There are lots of surgical and sometimes non-surgical procedures that are trying to prevent your stomach from stretching, thus not allowing you to eat as much food, and the logic being that would help you lose weight. I'm not advocating that you do this. I'm just telling you, when you see those advertisements, that's what they're trying to do. The inside of your stomach has all of these little wrinkles, and this is the name for them, gastric rugae. And kind of like an accordion, they stretch as food enters. So your stomach is made out of muscles. Very specifically, there are muscles at the beginning and the end of your stomach. And your stomach is a big stretchable bag. Now, when we say it's stretchable, don't assume that means it's just tissue laying there. Your entire stomach is covered with muscle that helps squish and move the food around. So if you recall that video I showed you, the food was swirling around in the stomach. That's the sound that you hear sometimes. That's the muscles in your stomach pushing your food around, kind of like a blender. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask about stomach anatomy or the basic function of the stomach? So I'll just pause for a second because I see a few people writing. We're looking at here a gastric gland, which is found in each of the little wrinkles or the gastric rugae that are in your stomach. There's not. So here's what I'd like to show you about this chart. Do you have to write down every single detailed thing that's on there? No, I want you to get the basic idea that a gastric gland goes down fairly deep and has a bunch of different kinds of cells. We're not going to focus too much on the different cell types, but moreover on the substance that is coming from them. So this is the side of the chart that you really need to be responsible for, what is produced in a gastric gland, and not so much which particular cell name is producing each of the substances. So here are some of the things that are secreted. First, mucus. Your stomach produces and secretes mucus to protect the lining of your stomach. If you did not have this mucus, well, your stomach would digest itself. And so mucus is coming from the top part of the gastric gland, from a mucus cell. And from those same types of cells is coming another substance that's there for protection. Bicarbonate is a base. Bases neutralize acids. And so your stomach is helping monitor and control the pH in your stomach by producing a base to help counteract any excess acid that's already there. So realistically, you shouldn't ever have to consume something to control how much stomach acid you have if everything is working normally. The third thing that's important is gastric acid. Your gastric acid is HCl, and I'll just write the chemical name for that. That is hydrochloric acid. So that's the acid that your stomach is producing and secreting. Now, you're not going to be responsible for this intrinsic factor. We're not going to focus too much on that particular substance. A few of the other substances affect acid. So if you notice here, histamine stimulates acid. So does gastrin, whereas somatostatin inhibits acid. These are all substances that will stimulate your stomach to make more acid or tell your stomach to make less acid. And just because we're going to talk about one of these a little bit later again, I'd like to point out that gastrin is involved with a hormone. And we're going to talk a little bit about hormones that control things in your digestive system later. Now the other two things, and I love the name of the cells they come from the chief cells, kind of like they're the boss of what's happening. These two things are enzymes. So pepsin, and then it has ogen in brackets. The reason it's written like that is because it's called pepsinogen until it meets up with acid. The acid activates it, and then we refer to it as pepsin. So, if I take pepsinogen and I add acid, I get pepsin. So that enzyme requires your stomach acid to be active. The other enzyme that we have here is lipase. And the name of the two enzymes kind of tells you what they do. If I look at pepsin, I told you guys probably on the second or third day of bio that when a word has pep in it, it means a particular type of macromolecule. And since we already mentioned that the stomach's main job is to digest proteins, this is me reminding you that in biology, words that start with pep are referring to proteins. So pepsin is there to digest a protein. Gastric lipase is there to digest lipids. Now that's a minor function compared to the digestion of protein, but it is something that happens. So those are the things that are produced in a gastric gland.